Hello, my name is Charlotte Bell and I'm going to be giving a talk on Romano British women and the diversity of social identities. Before I get ahead into the talk itself, I just want to introduce myself a bit more. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Liverpool and my thesis focuses on the misrepresentation of Romano British women. I'm looking at a mortuary comparative model between female Iron Age burials and female Romano British inscriptions and burials. So, my purpose today is I will be introducing you to the epigraphic material, so that's inscriptions, and how I'll be using inscriptions to identify social diversity in Romano British women. So we have a lot of assumptions around eliteness, that the inscriptions must have been elite because of the expense of erecting these inscriptions. So I'm really going to highlight how this is an assumption we need to steer clear away from, and we need to depend on the analysis, the epigraphic analysis itself. Also going to introduce subversion of gender. Not all these women met the domestic portrayal that we have in our minds and that has been previously used in scholarly interpretation. And I'm also going to introduce this concept of migration of women through the analysis of the geographic distribution of these inscriptions. We can see a lot of women had migrated into Britain across the Roman Empire, and that's through this epigraphic analysis. And lastly, I'm going to highlight domestic women, that through the prosopographic approach, which is the study of names, we can see there is a definite lack of domestic women, that these women were not Roman, they were Celtic, they were Etruscan, they were Greek, and they did not all live within domestic spaces. So firstly, before we get into the epigraphic material, I want to discuss previous research that's been done on gender. So we're going to look at ancient DNA and bioarchaeology. We're going to look at other aspects which I'll introduce you to. Before we move on to those slides, just a sensitivity trigger. There will be images of skeletons on these slides. This is all to help us understand these burial contexts that I've been looking into. So I just want to highlight the research that was done for this Iron Age female warrior. This burial was discovered in Bryher in the Isle of Scilly. It was Iron Age, and the grave goods assemblage had included both male and female objects, both deemed objects. It had included a bronze mirror and a sword. The mirror has very much been exclusively associated with female remains, and so we can confidently say that mirrors are exclusively associated with women. There are no mirror burials for males, so this is a confident assertion. With the inclusion of the sword, that is very much associated with men, and as a result, conflict and warfare. But typically, women were not associated in that space. But as you'll see in further slides, that the skeletal analysis proves the opposite, that they were very much actively engaged in that area, in warfare, and we can see that through the osteological analysis. Some interpretations have previously resulted in the fact that this may have been a double interment, the fact that there's a male and a female grave good each, that maybe this was a double interment and the skeletal remains have not been found for the male. However, the analysis revealed no other skeleton was deposited there, and the skeletal analysis revealed that the individual was 96% female. So very confidently asserting that this individual was female, and she was associated with a sword, which is very revelatory and a very important piece of research. Individual possessed a sex development disorder, and as a result of that, the individual was identified as being identified as a woman. We can see this in the grave goods assemblage, where there is a mirror, there's a bronze neck ring, you can see that at the bottom by the feet, and we've got pottery on the other side of the feet as well. So we can see that this individual was represented as a woman by her community, because when we see burials, the dead do not bury themselves, their community bury them. So the grave goods assemblage is very much representing how the community and society viewed them. So we also have this publication by Redfern again in 2008. She carried out analysis of 51 individuals across lots of different sites in Dorset. So we're looking at settlements, hill forts, cemeteries. So a very large data set there. The result of that analysis was that females were very much dominated by violence. There was a large amount of skeletal trauma. We can see multiple injuries. There were also fractures isolated to the torso, spine, cranium and the arms. Fractures does not necessarily mean this occurred at the time of death, but may have been a prior event. It could have been an internal event as opposed to the onslaught of the Roman event, especially at Maiden Castle. So we can see that females not only engaged in active warfare when it was external, but also they, excuse me, it was also evident that they had sustained violent injuries prior to this as well. The result of this really is that human remains must be integrated into the interpretation of gender. That is the only way that we can really confidently talk about their experiences in their life, the trauma that they sustained. So this is an aspect of gender analysis that really needs to be incorporated. So historiographic sources, there are many, by Tacitus, by Dio, and these are elite male historians, Roman historians. There are some texts on British women in Greek sources, but they are very slim. So that makes us very dependent on these elite male historians. They certainly do have a bias, which contributes to the representation of pre-Roman women. They very much focus on Boudicca, and they record her activities in the rebellion, and almost to the point where they're creating this caricature of Boudicca, which then gets passed on to the imagery of all British women. And this ostracises British women from the rest of the Roman Empire. They are seen as barbarians. Their active engagement in warfare and conflict and their clothing and the way they behave in warfare is very much juxtaposed against this ideology of domestic women that was promoted in Rome. And that is really the source of their isolation, the fact that they do not abide by this domestic imagery. So before we get ahead into the epigraphic analysis, I just want to introduce you to inscriptions if you might not have had any prior experience with inscriptions, what they are, what they can tell us. So if you just watch this video, it's just for a few minutes. What are Roman inscriptions?
This video will introduce you to Roman inscriptions. But what are inscriptions? Inscriptions is a Latin origin word, and Latin is one of the main official languages of the Roman world. Inscriptions means writing on things. In plus scriptio, on, plus writing, and the Romans did a lot of writing on things. You might also come across the Greek origin word epigraphy, which means the same thing. Epi plus graphy, on, writing. And you'll have found that graphy form in various words, such as biography or geography, calligraphy, which means beautiful writing, and paleography, which means old writing, which is the study of handwriting in the ancient world. So inscriptions means writing on things, and epigraphy is the study of writing on things. And someone who does epigraphy is an epigrapher or an epigraphist. Now, when we think of Roman inscriptions, we probably straight away think of those stone inscriptions in Roman museums. And there's a lot of those because the Romans liked writing into stone. Some of them are really big and impressive, with images carved on them, some of which would originally have been painted. But sometimes the stones can be pretty small, like this altar here. Roman epigraphy doesn't just include the stone inscriptions that we might find in museums. Many other objects were written into. For example, this bit of pottery here from Kent has got poetry written on it. Or they would write on stylus tablets like this one, which are filled with wax and then incised with a sharp object. Or they would write with ink on thin wooden leaf tablets like this one. You might have heard of some of these. You might even have seen some of these leaf tablets in the British Museum or at Vindolanda. But did you know that Romans also wrote on brooches and rings and barrels? They even stamped bread. We have what we think might be a stamp that might have been impressed into bread from Caerleon. Some of the things that Romans did with writing feel very familiar. They labelled their possessions, they wrote lists, they wrote tombstones for their loved ones. Other things are less obviously familiar. Thankfully, we no longer need deeds of sales of human slaves, such as this one from Poultry Lane in London. And we probably won't be able to easily guess what something like this might have been used for. This is a replica of an eye doctor's stamp. In the Roman world, eye doctors or oculists used to go around the provinces, and when they found someone who might need help with their eyes, they'd get out their medicine, they'd shape some of the medicine into a little stick a bit like this, and then they'd use the stamp to press into the salve like this. And that piece of salve would then say the name of the eye doctor and the condition, the eye condition, and the medicine that was used to fix it. Epigraphy is not always that easy to work with. Sometimes the texts are really hard to read. Romans annoyingly love to abbreviate everything, and when they did cursive handwriting, it can be really tricky to decode. Here's a picture of the text on the pottery I showed earlier from Kent. Pretty tricky to read that, isn't it? Most of the texts from Roman Britain are in Latin, And luckily, RIB Online gives translations for everything. Latin is such a fun and interesting language to learn, and perhaps these texts will inspire you to find out more. And one day, if you want to learn what all the brackets and dots mean in the additions of the texts, you can learn epigraphy if you do classics at university. We hope you'll explore the Roman inscriptions of Britain online and will enjoy being an epigraphist.
Okay, so that was really just an introduction to inscriptions. If you're not aware of what they are, how they work, and what context you'll find them. So I hope you enjoyed that and maybe make use of the Roman Inscriptions of Britain website. So my epigraphic approach is to identify social diversity for Romano British women. Through the epitaph, we can identify the relationship the female had to the dedicator. We can look at the funerary relief and analyse that. That can tell us about the status of the female. And we can also make note of the mortality. So the age of the woman when she passed, that will typically be represented in the inscription. And we can also look at the ethnic background. In some cases this is referenced in the inscription. Other times we will have to use a prosopographic approach, which is the study of names, and we can identify whereabouts in the Roman Empire they hailed from through that. So, the statistics of epigraphy. Currently there are 3,439 inscriptions. A large amount of them are fragmentary. There are cases where we'll have the complete, but these fragmentary ones is where we really need to make use of our epigraphic analysis skills. And there are times where we can identify a female name, we can identify the age that they passed, and maybe the name of the dedicator. So we are getting some sort of analysis. We can include it in the statistics. But unfortunately there will be inscriptions that are weathered, and further research could be involved in that. So there is, if you look at the bar chart, a large male representation in the data set. There is an increased number of females that are dedicated, and we can also see quite a low amount of infants there as well. So if we look at the geographic distribution of the epigraphy, we can see that it is very much national. So we see representation across the entire country. We can see stuff all the way down in Bath and Dorset, but also all the way up in Scotland. So this is not an isolated practice, it occurs all over the country. However, the locations of these are very much associated with military spaces at Roman forts. So we can see the location of these women. They were associated with these spaces, and there is quite more of a cluster happening in the north of Britain. We can see a lot of these is along Hadrian's Wall. But in addition, we can see them sort of traversing Hadrian's Wall as well. So that's just a basic picture of the geographic distribution. Takeaway really is that they're very much associated with military bases and they occurred all over the country. Excuse me. So we're now going to look at all the individual inscriptions that illustrate social diversity. The first one is Boadicea. Now you may find that sounds quite familiar. Sounds very much like Boudica. So we can see straight away this is a Celtic name. It derives from Budi, which means victory. You may think, oh, maybe this is Boudica. Unfortunately, it's not. It was dated to AD 200, so it was definitely not Boudica. We have a female here who has passed, who maybe was named after Boudica, or the parents wanted her to be associated with her Celtic identity a lot more. At the top of the gabled tombstone, you can see that there's a relief of a Greek deity. This is Oceanus. Excuse me, got a bit of a tickle. So we've got a Greek deity at the top, yet she's Celtic, and the inscription is in Latin. So we're seeing an amalgamation of lots of different identities there. We can see from the inscription that she lived 27 years and that she was a wife. Interestingly, when it was found, there was a male skeleton beneath the tombstone. This may indeed have been the dedicator, it may have been the husband. So that is both. And we have Tadia Volornius. So Volornius is a Celtic name from Romano, which means chief. Again, another otherness to the name. And Tadia is from the Greek Theodorus, which means God's gift. That was more specifically dated to 100 to 200, so a bit more early on in the Romano-British period, but very much a settled period. And if you look at the top of the tombstone, you can see an engraving of a crescent moon. Now this, the presence of the moon on inscriptions is very common, both in male and female military inscriptions, but it's very much been under researched. I've spoken to quite a few museum curators, and they are just not sure what it means. And I have done my own tentative research and believe that it may reference the deity Luna, so it may have been a religious reference. And we can see in the inscription that she lived 65 years, which is quite a respectable age for Roman Britain, and that she was a mother. And we have Caesarea Carotica. Carotica is a Celtic name, and that comes from Car Eco. Unfortunately, we don't have the meaning of that, but we know that it is Celtic. Caesarea, that is coming from Latin, and is derived from Caesar, which means leader. Another very, surprising name for a woman to have, not meeting this domestic portrayal of women. And in the inscription, we can see that she lived 48 years and that she was a wife. And there's the reference of sons, so we can see that she was a mother. And we have Julia Velva. Velva is Celtic and comes from Velicatus. And Julia, although may appear Latin, actually originated from Greek, from Aulus, and means downy bearded. That was dated to AD 200 to 300, so a bit more later on in the settled period of Roman Britain. You can see that there's a funerary banquet scene there, and you can see the deceased is laying on the couch. She's got her heir at the front and some form of servants at the front. It is a very typical funerary banquet scene, very much associated with Roman culture. The pine cones at the left and the right at the top, again, is a very common theme to have, and was associated with immortality, so was a very apt symbol to have on the tombstone. And in the inscription we can see that she lived 50 years. This one's a very interesting one, where it's coming for Rosonia Aventina, and in the inscription she is referenced as a tribeswoman of Mediamitrici. Interestingly, when the Latin was being inscribed, the C was initially interpreted in the 1700s as centurion, which would have made her centurion, but this was a mistake. It stands for citizen, so citizen of the Mediamitrici. This was found in Bath. The Mediamitrici is a tribe in Metz in northeastern France, so that's where she is coming from. However, her full name is both Latin, and we can see that she lived to 55. And one of my favourite inscriptions is this one. I tentatively call her Vedica because there's some fragmentary aspects to her name. But she was a tribeswoman of the Cornovi, which is in Roxeter. This was dated to 171 to 230, so very much settled period in Roman Britain. And she has a relief, a very large relief of herself sitting in a chair, and you can see that she's wearing a torque. It's very much an Iron Age necklace, and it is the largest tombstone in Britain. And we can see from the inscription that she lived to 30 and that she was a daughter. And we've also got Regina, one of the most well-known inscriptions that we have. She was identified as a tribeswoman of the Cacciavolini, found in South Shields, and that was dated to 171 to 230, very similarly to Baedeker. And we can see that she had lived 30 years and was a wife, but in addition to this, she was also a freed woman. So it may have been that she was a slave, and her husband had married her and as a result had freed her. If you can have a look, we also have a crescent. You may not be able to see it very well, but it is on the box that she's reaching into, so we can see a religious reference there. We now have Curatia de Nicaea. This is a Greek name, and references Dionysus, which is the god of wine and festivity. So a very much religious reference. This is more securely dated to 201 to 250, very much settled period in the Romano-British period. And we have the familiar Roman funerary banquet scene there again. And we can see from the inscription. And we also have Aurelia Ea. So Ea is a Greek name, and it is associated with the Naiad, which are deities with the fountain at Ea in Colchis. And the Aurelia is Latin, meaning golden. And we can see in the inscription itself that she had come from Salona in Dalmatia. And she had lived to 33 years and was a wife. And now we have Julia Lucilla. This is very much a representation of a departure from domestic imagery for women. In the inscription, this inscription was dedicated to Rufinus. It was found in High Rochester in 1809. Unfortunately, there are 4 lines at the top missing. This inscription is incredibly weathered. I visited it in person. It's located in a church in the middle of nowhere in Northumberland, and is very weathered. But thankfully, we have an interpretation of the Latin inscription here. The senatorial rank is referenced. So Julia Lucilla is the dedicator, and she is referencing herself as a part of a senatorial rank, which is from CF, which is Charisma Femina, and describes the lowest ranking of senatorial order. But for any woman to possess any professional rank is very rare, let alone of senatorial order. So this is a big revelation. It really depicts the deviation from gender norms. It may have referenced her wealthy background. But what is particularly interesting is that Rufinus himself is not accorded senatorial rank, but the female dedicator is. So there's a definite control of self-representation. It is the only female dedicator in Roman Britain to have attributed herself to senatorial rank. And then we also have Iclio, and she or he has questionable gender. This is due to the funerary relief. The inscription panel is very weathered again, so it's the only thing we are able to decipher is part of the name, which is Iclio. The challenge of the funerary relief is the hair. The hair is very much feminized. The brooch is female. However, previous scholars have interpreted it as male due to the bulky shoulders. However, we do have other female funerary reliefs, such as Vedica and Decimina, who both have very bulky shoulders. So it's not something that we can use to identify, male or female. I looked into the analysis of the name. The suffix in the name, iklio, unfortunately is used by both male and female. So again, that confuses this interpretation even more. Hopefully in the future I plan to do more research on this inscription. There is a archaeological software called VRTI, and it basically is a software where you upload images of an object and it reveals details not visible to the naked eye. So we are going to get more information from the relief. We're going to get maybe more clarity from the inscription, and that they may then help us fully interpret the gender of this individual. So they were the examples. It was quite a lot of examples, but all of them demonstrated social diversity. So the female names, this prosopographic approach I've used, we can see that from the bar chart there's a very large representation of Latin names. That is to be expected. It is a way for women to integrate into Romano-British society post-conquest, to engage in Roman society by being accepted as I am now part Roman. I submit to this sort of membership, as it were. Surprisingly, there's quite a lot of Greek origins to the name, and that, to me, that is very surprising. Was not expecting that, to be honest. But there's a large number of Greek women entering into Roman Britain, and that is an area that I want to do further research in, this migration of women across the Roman Empire coming into Britain. Although there are some Celtic names, it's lower than I expected. It may be that pre-Roman women had moved to other areas of the Roman Empire, and that is the result. But you can see that clearly some pre-Roman women had decided to continue to reside in Britain and to then take on, to retain a Celtic identity, but also to take on other identities such as Roman and the use of Latin in their inscriptions, etc. So Celtic names and tribeswomen, there are inscriptions that reference as tribeswomen, as we saw with Lusonia Aventina and Vedica. However, not all Celtic females reference themselves as tribeswomen. The only way I was able to identify that is through the prosopographic approach, which is obviously incredibly helpful. It raises the statistics of Celtic women in Roman Britain. So the female meaning. So we're using the prosopographic approach to identify these ethnic diversities, but we look deeper and we can see the meanings of these names. We can see that there's a low domestic female representation, and you can see that in the pie chart there. There's a larger representation of otherness to the names than there is domestic, so that's very interesting. We can see that these women in Roman Britain were not predominantly Roman, or they did not subscribe to this Roman ideology of, domestic representation. There's also a lot of large representation of religious meanings. It may be that was a tradition that was brought in by Greek women, and the generic is represented to a very high degree, so that is neutralised. That is not domestic, but it's not otherness. It is just sort of neutral. So that was a a lot of those were Celtic, and it's a very sort of common tradition in those choosing of names. So looking at the mortality, we can see, first of all, this graph is not fully representative because not every inscription referenced the age at which they had passed. So although I can give you this statistics of the mortality, just keep in mind that it is not fully representative. So the peak mortality of these women were 30 to 40. That is the very common age at which they passed. So you can see from 10 to 15 years up to 15 to 20 to 20 to 30, there's a clear escalation. So as they got older, from 10 up to 30 to 40, there's a clear escalation of the mortality. And then we can see it dips at 40 to 50. They're doing well, may be connected to their wealth and their lifestyle. And then we can see a rise again in 50 plus. And then we're not really seeing anything past 60 years. 60 years is the most. Interestingly, there's male inscriptions of a 90-year-old. That is very excessive, but we do not see any females that reach that age. So looking at the ethnic background, and this is based on the prosopographic approach, there is a large amount of the Greek population, females, settling in Roman Britain. We can also see a settlement of Iron Age females, so pre-Roman women were settling and continuing to live in Britain post-conquest. Although this isn't to a huge degree, it is still happening. So we can see there's a definite migration of females along the Roman Empire that is coming in to Britain. And the social status, excuse me, we can see a very large representation of wife and daughter. That is the predominant identity of these women in the inscriptions. So we can see then that there's a large patriarchal connection. If a female has an existing patriarchal member, they will be associated with them. It is just part of the tradition and part of the Roman culture that was adopted in Britain. So the elite assumptions really are coming from, oh, the size of the tombstone, oh, is there a funerary relief? But really we need to look into trio nomina. So that is the three names that made them a Roman citizen. Was the dedicator, did they have a trio nomina? There are no trio nominas for females, by the way, but if they are associated with the dedicator who does have a trio nomina, that could relate to eliteness, and also their participation in society. So conclusion, I just want to bring all the results together and discuss what this means. So firstly, we can see a definite adoption of Roman traditions. We can see they are using Latin. They are all using Latin in their inscriptions. They are using the funerary banquet scene, which is a very Roman imagery. And then we can see the settlement of British Iron Age women. Some pre-Roman women are deciding to stay in Britain. Some may indeed have left Britain at that time. But we can also see, in addition to some women leaving Britain, we're seeing this migration of not only Greek women but Celtic. So we're seeing people from France and Sardinia coming in, and also people from Greece coming in. So there's a lot of movement of women at this time. But there's also a low number of domestic women. There are some who are very domestic and very much nuclear family, etc. but there's very much, in terms of the prosopographic approach, a low number of domestic women, which is revelatory and makes us question what type of women were in Roman Britain. They were not Roman, although they lived in Roman Britain and adopted some of the traditions. They were Greek women, they were Celtic. This is their original background. So we can also see in terms of the mortality, most passed between the years of 30 and 40. This may have been the lifestyle that they engaged in, and we can see that patriarchal associations were important. It may be that alluded to their high status. They were only able to assume high status through the connection to their male relative or male heir. And then this assumption of eliteness. There are obviously eliteness, but some of them aren't. We have some with singular names, with very short inscriptions like Silicina, not given much information, there's not much decoration, there's no relief, no engravings. So we can see that not all these inscriptions referenced elite women, and that's something that we need to challenge. And then we also see a subversion of gender norms. We see women with senatorial status. We see individuals potentially with Iclio who may have both male and female gender identities. That's another thing that we need to look into. But this is my conclusion for the talk. I hope you found this interesting. And I want to say thank you for coming to hear my talk and about my research. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or talk to me. And thank you again.